If there was ever a leader the world assumed was untouchable, it was Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro. For years, the narrative felt settled, backed by Russia, financed by China, shielded by anti-US alliances. The assumption was simple: no global power would allow Washington to physically touch him. Then reality broke that illusion. When pressure reached its peak, the response was not diplomatic outrage or symbolic condemnation. The United States sent its own military force, not advisors, not intermediaries. American units were deployed, and Maduro was arrested directly, bypassing the assumption that sovereignty alone guarantees safety. There was no regional war, no global standoff, just execution of leverage at a moment of maximum isolation. This is where expectations collapsed. Russia did not intervene. China did not escalate. Statements were released. Concerns were expressed. But no one stepped forward to block the outcome. The image of unbreakable protection dissolved in real time. This is not a story about abandonment or betrayal. It is a story about how power actually functions in the modern world. Public geopolitics is loud and emotional. Real geopolitics is quiet, institutional, and brutally selective. Support exists until it becomes expensive. The arrest exposed a deeper truth. Alliances today are not guarantees. They are calculations. When the cost of intervention outweighs the value of the ally, restraint becomes strategy. Russia avoided direct confrontation. China avoided entanglement. Both protected their systems, not the man at the center of the crisis. In the past, power meant standing beside someone no matter the price. Today, power means knowing when not to stand at all. The shock wasn't that Maduro was arrested. The shock was discovering how alone a leader can be when usefulness expires. To understand why this outcome was not an accident, but an inevitability, we first need to dismantle a popular myth about alliances, protection, and how global power really decides who gets saved and who doesn't. For decades, global politics has been explained as loyalty versus betrayal. If a country stood with you yesterday, it would stand with you tomorrow. That logic made sense during the Cold War, when ideology hardened alliances into fixed blocks. Capitalism versus communism left little room for hesitation because switching sides meant losing the entire system. That world no longer exists. Modern geopolitics runs on transactions, not vows. States do not protect leaders, they protect interests. Support is extended when it reduces risk, expands leverage, or preserves stability. When those conditions change, support is recalculated, quietly and without sentiment. This is where many observers misunderstand Russia and China. They are not patrons offering permanent shelter. They are systems designed to minimize exposure. Their relationships are conditional, reversible, and constantly reassessed. Public statements may sound defiant, but policy is written in spreadsheets, supply chains, and sanction models. Maduro's position was never guaranteed by friendship. It was sustained only as long as he delivered value. Strategic signaling for Russia, repayment and assets for China. Once the costs of association rose faster than the benefits, loyalty stopped being an asset and became a liability. This shift marks the difference between past and present power. Ideological allies once absorbed pain together. Today, pain is outsourced or avoided entirely, which leads to the real question. When pressure peaked, what was Maduro actually worth? Russia's relationship with Venezuela always looked stronger from the outside than it was on paper. The optics were loud: joint statements, military visits, defiant rhetoric aimed directly at Washington. But beneath that noise sat a far quieter reality. Venezuela was never a strategic dependency for Russia. It was a symbol. That distinction matters. Russia did not rely on Venezuelan oil, technology, or trade to sustain its economy. In fact, Russia and Venezuela overlap more than they complement. Both are energy exporters competing for the same buyers under similar sanctions. This was prestige politics, not survival politics. As pressure on Nicolás Maduro intensified, Moscow faced a simple calculation. Escalation would not defend a critical asset. It would add a new front of risk. Russia was already managing sanctions fatigue, military commitments, and financial isolation elsewhere. Caracas offered symbolism, but escalation would demand real resources. So Russia chose restraint. Diplomatic language remained sharp, but action stayed limited. This is the contrast that defines modern power: public posturing versus private risk management. Venezuela mattered as a signal of defiance, not as a battlefield worth paying for. When costs rose and benefits stagnated, the relationship revealed its true ceiling. Russia didn't lose Venezuela. It simply refused to convert symbolism into exposure. If Russia saw Venezuela as optional, China saw it as something else entirely. China approaches power from a fundamentally different angle. Where others focus on leaders, Beijing focuses on systems. Governments change, strongmen fall, infrastructure, contracts, and repayment structures endure. That mindset shaped China's posture toward Venezuela from the beginning. For China, Venezuela was never about protecting a man. It was about protecting capital. Billions in loans were extended against oil shipments, collateralized through long-term supply agreements. In that framework, leaders are replaceable. Contracts are not. Intervening militarily or politically would have violated China's own doctrine of non-interference, and worse, it would have tied Chinese assets to Venezuelan instability. Beijing's priority was recoverability, not regime survival. As long as oil flows and obligations remain enforceable, the system works regardless of who occupies the palace. This is why China's response felt cold to many observers. But it wasn't abandonment, it was insulation. China did not walk away from Venezuela. It stepped back from Venezuelan politics. Even combined, Russia and China had leverage. So why didn't they act together? At the global level, power is enforced less by tanks than by systems. Rescuing a sanctioned leader triggers consequences that rarely make headlines but reshape outcomes. Secondary sanctions ripple outward, touching banks, insurers, shipping firms, and clearinghouses. The punishment is quiet, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. This is the invisible side of power. Troops and speeches signal intent, but access to dollar clearing, insurance coverage, and trade finance determines survival. Any state that intervenes inherits the target's isolation. Transactions slow, costs rise, partners quietly step back. What looks like strength becomes long-term drag. For Russia and China, this was the real danger. Helping Maduro would not end pressure, it would transfer it. Supporting him openly would invite scrutiny on their banks, disrupt energy trading, and contaminate unrelated supply chains. Global finance does not retaliate loudly. It simply prices risk higher until participation becomes irrational. Modern power therefore operates defensively. It avoids traps rather than charging into them. Strategic restraint preserves optionality, while intervention hardens exposure. Saving one leader can weaken an entire system. At this point, the question shifts. It is no longer about why Russia and China did not save him. It is about why, inside this system, saving him stopped making sense. The logic is cold, structural, and unforgiving, rewarding distance while punishing emotion and impulsive displays of loyalty globally today. In the early years, Nicolás Maduro offered leverage. Venezuela's oil reserves, geographic position, and open defiance of Washington created relevance. Supporting him signaled resistance. The returns were political and symbolic, but they existed. Over time, that equation deteriorated. Economic collapse reduced output. Infrastructure decayed. Governance instability turned commitments unreliable. What once looked like leverage became maintenance. Each additional year required more support for less payoff. This is how states reassess partners, like assets that depreciate. Early on, defiance functions as leverage. Later, the same defiance becomes liability. Unpredictability raises risk premiums. Coordination becomes harder. The cost of association quietly climbs. For external powers, the priority shifts from stability to survivability. A stable partner absorbs pressure. A surviving partner exports it. As Maduro's control weakened, his ability to deliver certainty vanished. Supporting him no longer preserved influence. It multiplied exposure. When a leader reaches this stage, backing them stops being strategy and becomes sentiment. And sentiment is expensive. Modern power systems do not reward loyalty to individuals. They reward predictability, continuity, and low-friction outcomes. Venezuela ceased offering those conditions, and with that shift, its strategic value faded. This decline was gradual, structural, and obvious to institutions that measure risk, rather than react to headlines in real time. History is filled with leaders who believed protection was permanent, only to discover it had limits. From client states to proxy regimes, support has always come with ceilings, even when it looked unconditional. Venezuela fits cleanly into this pattern, not as an exception, but as confirmation. Modern geopolitics no longer relies on dramatic rescues. Power today prefers pressure over confrontation, adjustment over occupation. Systems are designed to let crises unfold just far enough to force change, without assuming responsibility for the outcome. Collapse is not always prevented, it is managed. This is deeply uncomfortable because it contradicts how power is sold to the public. We expect guarantees, we expect alliances to activate automatically, but stability is not enforced by intervention. It is shaped through incentives, constraints, and selective absence. In this model, leaders are allowed to fail as long as failure does not threaten the system itself. Support fades gradually, signals become ambiguous, and responsibility disperses. No one announces abandonment. It simply becomes obvious too late. What happened to Venezuela reflects this logic. External powers influence the environment without owning the result. Pressure accumulated. Options narrowed. Adjustment replaced rescue. The realization is unsettling. No leader is ever fully protected. Backing exists only within tolerable risk. Once that boundary is crossed, support becomes silence. And silence, in modern geopolitics, is not weakness. It is how power withdraws without being seen. That quiet withdrawal defines the age we are living in, where influence remains present even when protection disappears completely and deliberately. In the end, Russia and China did not fail to save Nicolás Maduro. They chose not to absorb his risk. That distinction matters because it reframes the entire story from morality to mechanics. Protection in modern geopolitics is conditional. It depends on usefulness, predictability, and cost. Allies are not shields. They are mirrors reflecting value back to the system. When that value fades, protection thins without warning. This is why the most powerful actors rarely make dramatic moves. They let structures decide. Financial access tightens, legal pressure expands, options narrow quietly. By the time outcomes become visible, decisions were already made months earlier. For leaders watching from other capitals, the lesson is stark. Survival no longer depends on who stands beside you at press conferences. It depends on whether the system still needs you. Influence flows toward stability, not defiance. Support flows toward low risk, not loyalty. Maduro's fate exposes the illusion at the heart of modern power. Backing feels permanent until it isn't. Guarantees feel solid until they are tested. The most dangerous assumption in geopolitics is believing someone else will pay the cost for you. In this system, no one volunteers to inherit another leader's risk. Power protects itself first, always. That reality defines this era, where restraint replaces rescue, and silence often carries more force than action globally.